Well, good morning, everyone. And to those of you who were with us yesterday, welcome back. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. It's still a little bit early on Saturday, sorry. I am fortunate enough to know two of our panelists today fairly well, and I'm absolutely delighted to be meeting Jeanne Cummings for the first time. And I'll expand on that a bit in a minute. I'm very glad that she could join us. And I can say with confidence that this is probably going to be a great way to spend a Saturday morning. I think we're in for a treat. And how can we not be with this panel addressing a topic as provocative as ours? Can they say that? Protections in political speech on the web. I'm going to talk about that just for a minute to sort of set the table, and then our panelists can take off from there if they want, or they can ignore what I say entirely. It's completely up to them. So I'll make a few remarks and then I will introduce our panelists. My colleague, Ed Wasserman, who is our Knight Professor of Journalism Ethics here at Washington and Lee, has weighed in on the topic that we're attempting to address today in a couple of his recent newspaper columns, which are themselves subject to a wide pass-along readership online, particularly on blogs. He's the darling of the bloggers. They either love him or love to hate him. And these columns generate a lot of back and forth. Now, let me share some of Ed's thoughts with you from those recent columns. He says, what's apparent is that although legacy media may regard their websites as domesticated showcases for their traditional work, heeding the same rules, the internet is no petting zoo. It's a wilderness, and the wildlife has free-ranging ideas of their own about what they should be doing. As traditional news outfits migrate online to become .coms, one of their biggest headaches is how to adapt to the sprawling new frontier of public comment. In the pre-internet world of TV and newspapers, public comment wasn't a problem. Broadcast news didn't have any, aside from the weekly guest spot, usually some hapless civic association president reading from a prompter and staring terrified into the camera. Papers had their letters pages, but allowed only enough space for a few dozen a week, and they were generally written with care and were easy to prune for taste and diction. Things were nicely under control. But on the internet, public comment isn't kitchen table talk, it's saloon brawl. Postings are sharp and rough and tumble. Harsh and derisive exchanges are common, so are personal attacks. Chat rooms and message boards routinely allow people to post comments anonymously. Only when postings are so egregious, so outrageous, racist, or vile that other participants cough up hairballs do managers strike the comments and banish the authors. And as we heard yesterday, there's not even consistent policy on what we do about that kind of speech and characterizations on the web. It comments also about the relationship between the so-called user-generated content and postings by people in response to journalism, and the relationship of that to what journalists who are blogging themselves are coming up with in those sorts of exchanges. He says that's the cyber pond traditional news organizations are diving into. They understand that their own futures hinge on reestablishing online the central role in civic life that they've played offline. They are eager to host forums where people in the communities they serve go first to offer comment. So they embrace the rambunctious discourse of the internet with the zeal of the convert and the sweaty fervor of the desperate. Got something to say? Tell us. Editors who would never dream of running an unsigned letter to the editor now argue for promiscuous anonymity. The taste in civility, respectfulness, all line values of a discredited media elite. I exaggerate, he says, but not that much. The new guiding principle is hands-off. Some organizations argue that they are providing a public space which they don't have the right, let alone the duty, to regulate. It will look after itself. But is the marketplace of ideas self-regulating? Is defamation canceled out by testimonials, falsehoods by truth? Or does internet talk promise another sad case of what the late ecologist Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons? Each individual herdsman benefits from putting one more head of cattle onto public pasture and suffers little from cumulative overgrazing. In this case, the extreme license given to individuals to vent, dissemble, excoriate, and indulge their hates verbally winds up destroying the expressive freedom that other people, less bold and less opinionated, need. Venturing an opinion, even a sound one, just isn't worth the risk. The overall result is a less expansive and sound less expansive, and sound, worthwhile thoughts aren't shared. People understandably conclude that rage is the political vernacular, that this is how public ideas are talked about. Well, let me introduce you to the people who will help us address some of those issues in the order in which you will hear from them. As I mentioned yesterday, your program tells you that Mike Allen of Politico.com was to have joined us. As you heard, he had a death in the family, but we are delighted that Jeanne Cummings of Politico.com is with us, and we're deeply grateful for her to agree to be with us on such short notice. Many of you see Ms. Cummings regularly on Washington Week, as I do, something of a Washington Week groupie, which is one reason that I'm happy to meet her in person, but also because of the work that she is doing, and as some of you heard yesterday, the sort of bold direction that Politico.com has struck out in. Ms. Cummings has covered politics at every level, from state and local governments to 5 presidential campaigns. In recent years, her focus has been on tracking money in politics. Her coverage has ranged from documenting the rise of well-financed independent political organizations to dissecting presidential candidate fundraising to tracking a wave of new companies opening lobbying shops in Washington. As chief lobbying and money correspondent at Politico, she will also oversee team coverage of both of those areas. Some of you may remember during the recent presidential campaign there was a minor flap about one of the candidates' wardrobes or something. That was Jean's story. She was first with the Sarah Palin wardrobe coverage, if you will. Ms. Cummings was recruited last year from the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau, which she joined in 1997 as a political reporter. She moved to the White House beat a year later and won the 2000 Aldo Beckman Memorial Award, the highest honor for daily White House correspondence, for her coverage of the Clinton administration. She also earned a journalism award at the Journal for her part in covering the Enron scandal and its connections to the Bush administration. Prior to working for the Journal, she worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, first in Atlanta covering politics and the governor's office, and then in its Washington bureau, where she tracked the career of former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, whom I heard on NPR this morning pontificating about the future of the Republican Party and who's going to lead it, and insisting that he was not going to. Everybody who believes that, raise your hand. In 1997, Ms. Cummings won a National Press Club Award for groundbreaking coverage of Gingrich's complex financial and political support network and the House ethics investigation of it. We will hear from Ms. Cummings first, and then we will hear from Professor Robert Strong, who, as many of you know, is our Associate Provost, Director of the Rupert A. Johnson Jr. Program in Leadership and Integrity, and the William Lynn Wilson Professor of Politics here at Washington and Lee. As an American Political Science Association Fellow in 1988 and 89, he worked in the offices of Representative Lee Hamilton and Senator Richard Lugar on Capitol Hill. Professor Strong is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, review essays, and has written 3 books, Decisions and Dilemmas, Working in the World, Jimmy Carter and the Making of American Foreign Policy, and Bureaucracy and Statesmanship, Henry Kissinger and the Making of American Foreign Policy. I may have conflated those latter 2 titles, Bob. I'm sorry. He's widely recognized as an authority on the U.S. presidency and presidential politics and elections, and I can attest that he has some wonderfully juicy anecdotes about the human failings of most of our 43 presidents and 1 president-elect. So he's a good man to find yourself standing next to at a cocktail party, believe me. Rod Smolla is Dean of Washington and Lee's School of Law. He's nationally recognized as a scholar, teacher, advocate, and writer. His wide-ranging scholarship includes 4 legal treatises, a casebook on the First Amendment, a co-authored casebook on constitutional law, and scores of articles in the nation's top law reviews. He also writes widely for general audiences, including popular books such as Deliberate Intent, Free Speech in an Open Society, Jerry Falwell versus Larry Flint, and Suing the Press. His commentaries appear frequently in national print and electronic media, Dean Smolla's writings have won frequent recognition, including the ABA Silver Gavel Award and the William O. Douglas Award. He's also won numerous awards for his teaching, including the Virginia State Council of Higher Education Distinguished Faculty Award. Dean Smolla has also been a nationally prominent advocate in cases involving constitutional law, civil rights, and mass media. He has presented oral arguments in state and federal courts throughout the nation, including the Supreme Court of the United States, and such as his influence as Washington and Lee's law dean, he was able to swear us all in yesterday as temporary U.S. Supreme Court justices to hear oral arguments that he presented, which was a terrific session, and I think a few of you were able to make that. So we will start with Ms. Cummings, go to Professor Strong, and then to Dean Smolla. Again, welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. So the topic, I guess, that we're talking about today is what are the standards, what can we say, and what do you get if you say it? Generally at Politico, and John probably talked about this yesterday, I mean, part of what we're trying to do at Politico is preserve what many of us love, which is newspaper reporting, newspaper writing, trying to find a way to make it survive the transition of the media. And so in many respects, the standards that we set for ourselves when we're writing a story for Politico are not at all dissimilar to the standards that I had when I was at the Wall Street Journal or the Atlanta paper. You know, we try to make sure we double or triple source important facts and stories. We try to be careful with off the records and backgrounds, just like any traditional reporter would do. What's interesting is that we have on Politico a mix. We have a newspaper side of our brain, and we have our bloggers on the other side. And that is, you know, it's a bit of an experiment, and the standards sometimes are different for the two, where the blog can become much more speculative. The sourcing on it can be less rigid than we have on the newspaper side of things. And that can create some confusion, and we still are learning about whether people who come to the site and read them view them differently. And we've learned some important lessons about that, which I'll get into in a little bit. But I think just to, you know, make a couple points about what we say and why we say it. One of the most important points I wanted to make is that we at least are trying not to become, you know, bloggers. We want to keep the standards of newspaper writing in the mix on the internet, in not a traditional newspaper form, but then on this hybrid site that we have created with just a specialized area of coverage. Then the other thing that we've learned are the comments and that you get on the stories. That was a real shock when I came over from the Wall Street Journal. One of my first stories that kind of took off a little bit, I got 200 comments, which back then was a really big deal. Now, if you aren't nearing 1,000, you've really screwed up and haven't the lead right. But I got curious, you know. I thought, wow, you know, they're really, I wonder what they're saying. And so I usually was too afraid to look, but I went through the comments to see what they were talking about. And I'd say the first 20 or 25, you know, were pro and con. They liked this, they hated that. I was a stinking liberal. No, I was crazy conservative, you know, all that sort of thing. And then I realized some commenter had basically rolled a stick of dynamite into the conversation, had nothing to do with my story, and they all got in a fight with one another. So the next 150 comments had nothing to do with my story, but was, you know, them all having an argument. So you have a fair amount of that goes on. But there are other things that the other thing that has been such an amazing revelation is how fast the people you write about read it. And you don't get that phone call in the morning if they're mad. You get it 5 minutes after the story went up. And so there's this instant reaction from the people that you're writing about. And in some cases, when I've taken calls like that, if, in one case, the Republican Governors Association was very nervous about, they didn't deny the quote, but they had said something really bad about their Republican brothers in Washington. But the way it was set up just scared them to death. And after they stopped screaming and we had like a real conversation about it, I thought, I could tweak that sentence very easily. And it doesn't hurt me at all, but it relieves some of this enormous stress. And so I went ahead and I did it. And so you can, you would never do that in some really substantive way in a story, but their reactions that, are something that we can listen to in time, and where appropriate, you can make a minor adjustment to the story in a quick way, which I actually think is a good thing, because we write on deadline, and anybody who writes on deadline knows when they read it the next day, they think, I probably could have done that a little bit better. Now, I'm not suggesting you go in and continually tweak with your copy, but you can make these kinds of small adjustments, which makes the connection between you and who you're writing about and who you're writing for much more intimate and real. The other thing that happens is that readers catch things. I mean, you have basically 1,000 editors when you put the thing out. And I, in a sleep-deprived moment last Friday, was kicking out a story on the Georgia runoff, and throughout wrote that the Democrats were near a 60-vote veto-proof majority. And it was just like the brain stopped working after only 3 hours sleep for a few days. And a reader very nicely just pinged me on my email, not a comment, although I didn't look, it was probably in the comments too, but they pinged my email and said, I think you mean filibuster-proof, which of course I did. And so then I emailed the web team really quickly, and they switched it in the story. So that can happen as well. And there again, I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I'm grateful to the readers who might catch something like that, where I emailed the reader back, I don't know who this person is, but I said, thank you for the note, you're right, and I need sleep, and I fixed it. So that has really changes the sense of sort of community. I write big stories and short stories for the Wall Street Journal, and get 4 or 5 calls from people I know commenting on them, and maybe 10 emails, but it's nothing like the intensity that goes on in this day and age. And then finally, what some people do at Politico is they link to all kinds of things in their copy. That's a new development for those of us who write newspaper, who come out of a newspaper tradition. I personally am not a fan of that. I feel like you either do your reporting or you don't. And if you need to link because someone broke a story first, that makes a whole lot of sense. But I think it's something that should be done sparingly, in part because it creates a lot of risks. There's one reporter who works for me who did a very good story on Axelrod and his life as a consultant and how much money he had made. And in that story, linked to another story from a different publication. And that story, the other publication story, the Axelrod and Company believed was wrong. Now, they had their fight with the other organization. We didn't know about it. There wasn't an obvious correction on the story, so the reporter had linked to it. But so then we get the crush of the complaints on us for reporting we didn't do. And so therein lies a risk that I think more often than not is best to err on the side of prudence. And if you didn't do it, you don't know how good that story is, so be careful about that. And then I'll just go over 2 other just small vignettes. When I was talking about the standards with the blogging side of our brain and the newspaper side of our brain, we learned a really searing lesson about what standards we use very early on, when one of our very excellent reporters and bloggers, Ben Smith, was doing reporting on whether John Edwards would drop out of the presidential campaign because of his wife's return of cancer. And Ben had a very good source who told him that Edwards was dropping out. And so there was some discussion in the office, and the feeling was it's going on the blog, so it's okay with this single source because the source was very credible. So Ben put it up. You all probably know that he was wrong. He took it down very quickly. We took a lot of heat for that. And being a new publication, it was damaging to us. And the lesson we learned was that readers don't necessarily, in a publication like ours, think there are two different standards. If you're a pure blogger, that's one thing, but we aren't. And we realized that the expectations for our site are such that you can't necessarily play too loose on the blogs and expect people to say, well, that was just the blog. When they do the real news story, it will be better or different or of a higher quality. People don't come to our site and expect that sort of two-tiered system. And so first we took the lesson home about sourcing and fully reporting. And then the other thing was to write only what we know. Even in the blog, write only what you know. And Ben could have avoided a great deal of the complaints if he had written what he knew, which was that a source had told him this. Instead, what he posted was Edwards is getting out in kind of a voice of God. So that was the other lesson learned, is that the phraseology is important. He still could have posted it on the blog, and we would not have taken the same kind of heat, and we would not have been wrong. But instead, because of the language we used, we were wrong. So taking that lesson to heart, when I stumbled onto Macy's and Neiman Marcus and all the rest of it, when I went into the RNC reports a couple weeks ago, I went looking in those reports actually for television advertising ads. So I didn't know what I was going to find, although I was curious if I would find the wardrobe, because just some of us had been talking and wondered at the expense that was being put out for her clothes. There was, some instinct in you says, look, it might be there. But in this case, I wasn't looking, but I went over and I looked for the ads, and I literally stumbled over Macy's and then the rest of them. And I was sitting there like, oh my gosh, And I said to a colleague who sits next to me, I said, Charlie, I do believe I've just found Sarah's wardrobe. And he was like, what? And I said, come here. And so what did I have? I had the $150,000 worth of expenditures called campaign accessories at clothing stores, top brand, high end, on a date, September 10th. I didn't have Sarah Palin's name. It didn't say Sarah Palin's clothes. So what to do with this? It was obviously her clothes. I got comment from the campaign in which I specifically said, this is Sarah Palin's wardrobe. Who took her shopping? Is there more shopping going on for the Palin family? I embedded the assumption into my questions to them. I did not ask them, is this her wardrobe? Because I didn't want them to have an easy out. They had to come back at me and say, you've got it all wrong, if they wanted to. So what they wrote back was essentially a very nicely worded no comment, which is we don't talk about our strategic expenditures. So fine. So when I first put that story together, I had to say in the lead, it appears to be Sarah Palin's wardrobe. And that was the lesson learned from Ben, that's how it was written. And then I documented my questions to the campaign, which embedded the assumption in them, their response, and then laid out the expenditures. That hit the web probably at 8 o'clock, and the world blew up at about 8:05. And I've never had a story have such searing impact. And we knew it would be a talker. We didn't expect a screamer, but it blew into something bigger than any of us imagined. So about an hour and a half later, the campaign issued a second statement saying it's silly to be talking about wardrobes and blah, blah, blah. And with that, I went back into the story, stripped out appears, stripped out all the conditions on it, because through their comment, they had confirmed, indeed, it was her wardrobe. So there again, the ability, if I had written that for the Wall Street Journal the next day, we might have been able to come back and write a more definitive story. Whereas on the internet, you can react in real time to data as it comes in. And in that case, we put update on the story and that sort of thing to signal to readers that there is a significant factual change in the story, so that people just don't view it and think it's, that's weird. I thought I just read this and now it looks a little different. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview to launch our discussion about, sort of the new realities of trying to do journalism in an old-fashioned way in the brand new medium that we are living in today.
Well, I'm not quite sure why I'm here. I'm a political scientist, but I don't study constitutional law and the First Amendment, and even if I did, I wouldn't admit it, sitting next to Smolla. I'm not a journalist and have never been one. Moreover, I'm a consumer of journalism, but I'm a consumer of the dull and old-fashioned variety. I actually read newspapers and watch candidates on television, and only occasionally go to my computer and visit the websites like the one you work for. What can I add to your discussion? I want to just make a few brief comments about some of the complaints I would have about the quality of presidential speech in this election cycle, because I think it is related to the broader topics you've been talking about. And before I do that, let me preface my remarks by saying I'm one of those people who think this was a really good presidential election cycle, and there are all kinds of things we can celebrate. We had the largest voter turnout we've had since 18-year-olds received the vote, over 62%. That's a real plus. We had two candidates who I think had admirable personal stories that people could be proud of. We had a clear choice in these two candidates. They had different positions on the war in Iraq. They had different positions on domestic issues. We knew who was the more conservative, who was the more liberal. And in both cases, we had reasons to hope that whichever candidate won would be less partisan than other members of their political party. So we had good candidates. We had a clear choice. We actually made a clear choice. We didn't have to stay up late at night on election night. I'm famous on campus. I threw a party 2000 election night, and the posters all across campus said, "Free pizza until we have a new president."
December 20th?
People were knocking at my door for weeks. It got old. So this was an election that had a really clear result. They are recounting in Minnesota and Alaska and a few places, but the national conclusion is an absolutely certain one. So again, there are lots of good things we could say about this presidential election cycle. But I want to point out some things that were really disappointing, or things that were odd, and things that are related, again, to the subjects you've been talking about in this conference. The first observation is about how awfully cautious and repetitive presidential candidates have to be. Now, again, this is an old observation, but one that I think has gotten much, much worse. You've been talking for the last day and a half about the new way in which information is disseminated. The flip side of that in the digital age is the new way information is collected. Everything you say can be on someone's cell phone. Every appearance you make can be captured on film. The odd things your minister has said over a long period of time can all appear very, very quickly in video clips. Every campaign now has to worry about what we in Virginia call macaca moments. And every serious campaign has people who follow the opposition candidate around in the hope of collecting one of those. And again, even in this very good election cycle, we spent an inordinate amount of time and mental energy talking about one comment at a San Francisco fundraising gathering about people who were bitter and clung to their God and guns. It was even worse when a casual remark was made to an Ohio plumber. How did that become so big? Well, again, part of the reason it becomes big is that in both of those cases, it's not the media organizations, it's the opposition campaign, wanted to take advantage of a tiny piece of language that was off message. A tiny piece of language that could be stretched, and in the case of Spread the Wealth, inordinately stretched, into an attack against your opponent. Is the lesson that future presidential candidates are going to learn from the current climate in which we campaign? Never say anything interesting. Never say anything that isn't tested or scripted. And again, this is an old issue, and one we've talked about in terms of presidential politics for a long time, but in an age in which we easily collect, we easily disseminate information, the degree of caution that candidates are going to have to exercise is going to be, I think, painful. And we're not going to have candidates like Obama very often. This is someone who can say the same thing over and over again and remain interesting. This is someone who's really articulate and who I think captured the themes that we really did care about. So that talk about change and talk about the things he put into his main message didn't get as boring as it will with many others. Joe Klein, author of Primary Colors, and a established journalist who's written lots of things about politics. There's a book called Politics Lost, in which he covers a much longer period of time and laments the decline in the quality of presidential speech. Harry Truman actually went up to the podium to accept his nomination and threw out the speech that was written for him and said what he felt. It was so late at night there was hardly anybody watching, and the convention hadn't been a particularly good one. It was actually a good thing for him to go off script and speak his own mind. Klein admires the speech that Robert Kennedy gave in the city of Indianapolis on the night when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. It was again a speech no one had written. There wasn't time. It was a presidential candidate actually speaking from the heart. It was the first time Robert Kennedy had in a public setting ever mentioned the death of his brother. Those things don't happen anymore. And I think we're going to pay in the long run a high price in future campaigns for how cautious people are going to be. And we're going to pay a price in terms of the advice that presidential candidates receive. Samantha Power was a guest speaker on our campus just a few weeks ago. We asked permission to put her remarks, which were a very standard speech about her new book and not controversial in any way, on our website. And her answer was, no. Someone might find something. Maybe I maybe I was impolite to one of the student questioners who I didn't understand, or please, don't let anyone see what I've said. She was, of course, a person who called Hillary Clinton a monster, and did it in a conversation, wasn't it a Scottish journalist of a newspaper that no one had ever heard of outside of Scotland? The degree to which the people who surround presidents are going to be incredibly cautious about what they say is going to be a high price for us in the future. And just one final comment about a similar problem. When candidates are so scripted, and when they are so careful about what they say, and I think this, to me, was the low point in this presidential cycle. All three presidential debates, the moderators asked the obvious question. The economy has changed. We're in trouble. You can't possibly mean that we're going to do the things about taxes you've been saying for the last few months, or the things about new programming you've been saying for the last few months. Those were common sense questions. What did we get from both candidates 3 times? Absolutely nothing. I think we have some issues that we as a society have to think about in terms of the quality of our public political discourse. And again, I'm saying that against the grain of my earlier observation, which I really do believe, that these were pretty good candidates. This was a pretty good contest. And there are many things about this election, or presidential selection cycle, to be proud of. I think there are things we should also be worried about. And I want to just put those on the table for your comments and questions.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I come at this topic from a complex array of relationships. On the one hand, I'm on the board of directors of a medium-sized media company, Media General, which publishes the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Tampa Tribune, about 200 other daily and weekly newspapers, owns, I think, 25 television stations, ABC, NBC, CBS stations from New England down through Texas, and has an interactive media division, an online division. And I see, as a director of that company, the incredible struggle financially to try to determine whether you can keep the newspaper business alive, and I think whether you'll be able to keep the television station business alive, and the cultural dynamics of trying to figure out how to enter new media, and what it is that we do own that is of value. I think we like to think within Media General that is the ability to try to build community and enhance democracy and promote localism in the various local markets that we are in, so that we have reporters who can report on things that Political.com or the Washington Post wouldn't be interested in, a fight between a mayor and a school board and that sort of thing. And there's an intense fear that if metropolitan newspapers go away, there just won't be professional reporting of the kind that you need and community building of the kind that you need. But it's a tremendous struggle to figure out how to monetize that and keep that alive as the whole economic structure of media is just shifting dramatically. I'm in a second life, I'm an academic in which I try to discuss with some objectivity issues relating to the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the boundaries between what can be said and not said from a legal perspective. And I try to approach that with some scholarly objectivity and intellectual honesty. And as a teacher, I try to lead discussions about that with neutrality, so that all points of view come out. And students feel empowered to debate and express themselves. And then I have yet another life as a lawyer, and I have I've been very active as a litigator, and I've tended to be someone who defends speech in certain arenas. I often have defended highly unpopular political speech. I represented the Ku Klux Klan in a Supreme Court case involving cross-burning, for example, and the speech of Hustler magazine in a case brought by Jerry Falwell. And I represent a lot of advertisers, and so I'm a strong advocate for freedom of speech to advertise, and that includes outrageous advertising, and that, in a sense, props up the whole game to some degree. But where I have migrated and gone from arguably the side of good to the side of evil, to the dark side of the force, is that over about a 20-year period, I found myself moving from a position of reflexive sympathy for journalists and news organizations in libel and privacy matters, so that when I was at a forum exactly like this, in a room that seems identical, the same blonde wood, the same everything at William & Mary, as a younger scholar 25 years ago, I was absolutely cocksure that every libel suit ever brought against the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Richmond Times-Dispatch, there was no online then, was wrong, and the journalists were right, and this was a suppression of freedom of speech and democracy. And I have totally flipped. I've flipped in terms of my moral sensibilities and my legal sensibilities, my views as a scholar, and my role, because I'm now one of the more active repeat players on the national scene in significant libel and privacy suits, often against major media outlets, both in print and broadcast media and online media. And I think, as I think about my personal odyssey, early on in the process, it was actually not long after one of my first William & Mary pontifications, I met my first plaintiff. I met my first wrong plaintiff. He was actually a fairly well-known figure in a long-lost part of American culture and lore, a man named John Henry Falk. He was a storyteller and Texas raconteur and quite liberal attacker of sort of Republican sensibilities and so on in the 50s. And Falk was accused of being a communist, and Falk was one of the people blackballed by Senator McCarthy and so on. And he filed a lawsuit, and I had a buddy who was his buddy, a fellow Texan, and he introduced me, and we went to lunch, and suddenly I realized that this was a plaintiff. I had always thought these were mean, terrible, horrible people. In his mind, he was a fighter for civil liberties. Because in his mind, the speech was the oppressor. It was to be falsely labeled a communist, and the guts to go in and sue and say I'm not a communist was in his mind fighting for the good, and he was the champion of civil liberties. Very, very interesting psychology. It was interesting because I was introduced to him after I had railed about how bad that kind of lawsuit was. My theory being you should never be able to sue someone because they accuse you of being a communist, that that should be discourse and opinion. I've since found myself in the position of adopting this view that I very, very, very strongly believe and defend the extremely powerful set of legal doctrines that have evolved in the last 30 or 40 years that protect the press and protect speakers. So New York Times versus Sullivan is the most famous case, but there have been 30 or 40 Supreme Court decisions since then that reinforce that core decision. And I never fight those doctrines. I defend those doctrines. But much as we heard yesterday, you heard this from Judge Kaczynski a bit yesterday, if those First Amendment doctrines provide this gigantic area of freedom for discourse, for Political.com, or for anybody else, there's still this little reserve over here that if you step over this little line, there's still a 10% chance you are guilty of violating national security laws, invading people's privacy, libeling people, stalking, aiding and abetting violence. There's still a little room there where the First Amendment says you cross into this territory, you've done bad things, and a decent society should have a legal system that allows some redress and some remedy for that. And even in the crazy world of the internet, some of you may have heard the dialogue I had with Judge Kaczynski, you still, I think, want to try as best you can to preserve that little piece of accountability. It's probably impossible to preserve when the violators are, people in pajamas on the blogosphere, but it remains entirely possible to enforce it against the New York Times or Politico.com or anybody else, because they have addresses and assets and reputations and so on. And being a person who is willing to represent people who feel they've been destroyed because somebody crossed that line is a big part of what I now do. And it puts me in a lot of complex situations. I'll tell you just a few quick things about that world, because I think that's the most interesting world in terms of what we're talking about right now, and then I'll be quiet. The first thing I always try to do as a lawyer is try to determine if my client is telling me the truth or not. And the first thing I try to do, and I've done this with famous celebrities people that you would know, and political figures that you would know, and small people that you wouldn't know, private figures that you wouldn't know, that get swept into events and their lives are ruined because they're swept into things, sometimes because they intersect with a public figure. They're the person accused of having an affair with a senator and that sort of thing. What I try to do at first is say, if you did this bad thing, do not file a lawsuit. Go back and think about this. If you are guilty, do not file a lawsuit. You'll be destroyed again, and it'll be 1,000 times worse. And somehow the truth will out, and you cannot go in and say, I didn't have sex with this person, and you did. Somehow it'll be figured out. People will figure out your line, and so that's the first thing. You try to really determine if the person that you're representing didn't do the bad thing that they've been accused of doing. Then the other things that happen again and again and again are almost always, this is not every time, but almost always, when you look at the speech that is alleged to have caused the libel, there is debate over whether it really said that. And the reason there's debate, it's a lot like what you talked about your Sarah Palin story. The reason there's debate is very, very often because of the intense desire to be fast and to get the story out. The reporter or the news organization will not really have the story entirely nailed down. They won't know for sure that X happened. They may be suspicious that X happened. They may know they don't know whether X happened. They really don't know it, but there's all this rumor that X happened and all this buzz that X happened, and they've been working very hard to determine if X happened. And some pressure causes them to write a story before they know the truth. And the story is very carefully worded. And the story is carefully worded so they never quite exactly say that X happened, right? But depending on the nuances with which it's worded, depending on the headlines, depending on the nature of the quotes, depending on the structure of the article, depending on sometimes the flurry that begins to surround the article, often within minutes, right, as the bloggers hit and the other news organizations report on what this group has said, etc. Sometimes it crosses a line in which my instinct as a lawyer is they wanted the reader to believe that they knew what happened and that this is the truth. And even though the story's been, we heard yesterday, it's been lawyered. You heard the journalist say it's been lawyered. Even though it's been lawyered, as a lawyer, I can see if it's been lawyered, right? Even though it's been lawyered, it wasn't lawyered enough to dispel that innuendo or that implication. And the way the marketplace absorbs the story is they absorb it as this outlet saying that this person did this bad thing. And this person immediately denies it, and everybody else starts to have, there's a hubbub about it, and occasionally it turns out the story is just faulty. It's just wrong. The bad thing did not happen. And the bad thing really hurts somebody. And then that's when I'm tempted as a lawyer, if that person wants to sue for libel, to be part of the lawsuit and to help. There's usually a giant early battle over whether that article, that broadcast, is or is not susceptible of the meaning that the plaintiff claims it has. And that tends to be a giant early battle in the litigation. And the media outlet will constantly say, we never said it, look how we wrote this, it's unfair to drag us into court on this theory. And the plaintiff will say, you're looking at this like a journalism professor, you're looking at this like a lawyer, but the law says you look at it like readers and viewers look at it, and they don't read it with the perfect attention that you're now dissecting it with. Then, if you get past that, the battle tends to be over truth or falsity. Did the evil thing really happen or not? And that's where the battle should be. And then finally, over the fault of the journalists, because the New York Times standard requires that you prove actual malice, knowledge of falsity, or reckless disregard for truth or falsity if it's a public figure, or at least negligence if it's a private figure. And those tend to go to sourcing issues, and they tend to go to whether the source was credible, whether the journalist had a preconceived storyline and essentially written the story and then went out to try to gather facts to support the story, but did it in a dishonest way by only gathering facts on one side and turning a blind eye to opposing facts and so on. I'll leave with one anecdote, which is a case I can talk about because it's over, and it was against the National Enquirer. I've been involved in cases spanning from the tabloids on the one hand to very traditional mainstream media on the other. But this was a case, not a big case, kind of a small one, involving a wild party in which Mel Gibson had been on a drinking binge in Northern California and was alleged by the National Enquirer to have done cocaine with a bunch of women, kind of a bunch of groupies in Modesto and Fresno area, and then gone to a house and had brought two of the girls home to have sex. And I represented the only woman who was named by name in the National Enquirer piece. So they talked about a lot of characters, but only one person had a name. Her name was Angela Yao. And Angela Yao had brought Mel Gibson back to her house, and Angela's girlfriend had had sex with Mel Gibson. But Angela had not, probably because her father came into the house, saw what was going on, and said something like, "If you have sex with my daughter, I'll bust your face." Like, it's all right, man, it's all right. But the interesting thing was that the way the article was worded, there was this accusation of this cocaine use, and then there was the story of the wild party and Angela Yao going home. My client's theory, Angela's theory, was that if you read the article, the way you read it is, she was at the bar doing cocaine, part of the group doing cocaine, and then she was one of the two girls that left the bar and went to the house. Therefore, you've accused her of using cocaine. But she's never touched drugs in her life. She didn't use cocaine. She was never at any party with Mel Gibson using cocaine. It never happened. All right? Now, this is telling probably more than you want to know, but this is a classic example of what I'm talking about. The National Enquirer says the paragraph about cocaine comes at the top of the page, And the paragraph about Angela Yao and sex comes a couple paragraphs later, right? And the linking sentence is yet a middle paragraph. And in the middle paragraph it says, on that same trip to Modesto, Gibson met with two girls, all right? By the way, the paragraph about the cocaine says, after they did cocaine, they left the saloon with two girls. So it says, they left the saloon with two girls. Then it says, on that same trip to Modesto, Gibson had a wild night with two girls. And then it has Angela Yao, all right? So my theory of the case is, you got the 5 girls, 2 of them leave, same trip, they go to the house, there's Angela. That's why, right? Inquirer says, no, you're reading it the wrong way. Saloon takes place one day, then another night, the same trip, a different time, 2 different girls are having the sex. There's no connection between the sex and the cocaine. And here's the main thing they rely on are paragraphs. And they had all this stuff from journalism schools and English, and like I went to a Catholic school, you learn to outline sentences and stuff. And they had a big part of their brief about the role of paragraphs in our society, and how there's a stop at the end of a paragraph, and that's why you can't link these two things, and that's how well we thought this out, and that's why we're not guilty of libel. All right. So I go into court to argue this in Northern California in a federal court in front of one of the best federal judges in the United States, and he's a very, very bright guy. And I've been in front of him once before representing Carolyn Condit, who was the wife of Congressman Gary Condit, in her suit against the National Enquirer, in which they had created the impression that she killed Chandra Levy. So I was happy to be in front of this judge because I knew him as a very good judge. I walk into the courtroom, and he basically says, there can be no libel unless you say something bad about a person. This was in one paragraph. Your client's claim is in the other paragraph. It never says she did cocaine. And for 20 minutes, he basically reads what obviously is the opinion he's already written, that my side loses, right? And he said, Mr. Smolla, you come all the way from Virginia, you have anything to say? I said, well, Judge, it's the National Enquirer's motion. Don't you want to hear from them first? He goes, no, I don't think so. There you go. So I know he's already decided the case against me. So I get up and I say, Your Honor, and I go through all my theories as to why we have a right to get this in front of a jury, because juries would have read it the way I'm reading it. He's listening very politely. Clearly he doesn't accept a thing I said. So I'm almost ready to BlackBerry my client saying, I think we just lost the case. The National Enquirer gets up, great lawyer, I like very much, great First Amendment lawyer, and does what I probably would have done. He only talks for a minute. He thinks he's won the case, and no, don't want to mess it up. Your Honor, I believe everything seems to be exactly right, blah. Normally you're supposed to stop, but I was antsy, and the judge had sympathy to come all the way from Virginia to go out and argue the case. He said, Mr. Swain, you want to try again? Say anything? I said, I do, Your Honor. And it's one of those things that it's shameful how often this happens to me as a lawyer, but you think of it at the last second. We had been arguing this case using briefs and things printed in documents, and all the lawyering had been done the way you do, argue cases. But sometimes it's really important to see the actual thing. And I'm sitting there, and I've got the copy of the National Enquirer on the desk, right at the table, just like this. And I look at it, and suddenly something hits me that had never hit me before. I wish I had a blackboard. But if this is the page, if this is the newspaper, right? Here's the story, but there's pictures in the National Enquirer, and there's a picture with all kinds of cocaine paraphernalia, which adds to the evil of the story, right? And the picture, I'm going to use this. The picture is a circle, so it's like my law school. I probably shouldn't pollute it, but it's like the picture is a circle, with all this cocaine stuff in it, and the text circles around the circle. I get up to you, I want you to look at this. Now, how do we know what a paragraph is normally in English? Indentation. How can there be indentation when the text goes around a circle? You can't tell. You can't tell where any paragraph begins. All right. And then I said, and Your Honor, you have to admit that you would say, I win the case, if this article had been written and that critical sentence had said, on that same night in Modesto. If it had said on that same night in Modesto, you'd say for sure my client could have been one of the two girls. Can you throw a case out on the difference between the word trip and knife? All right? I said, you can't. Particularly when this whole thing is a sensational story about Mel Gibson, about all the evil stuff he does, drugs and sex, and they mention one human being, my poor client, Angela Yao, who didn't sleep with him and didn't do drugs and has really been damaged in this community because of the innuendo there. You take the circle and you take the word and you can't throw my client out. And we ended up winning. Just changed his mind. That's a little tiny case, a little tiny story, but that's how these battles get fought very, very, very often. I'm in a big one now involving a major media news outlet in which those kinds of dissections of the word choices, where quotes appear, etc., are the whole ballgame. And I guess I'll stop with the question whether you think this is kind of a sleazy business to be taking these cases to court, and this is a punishment of free speech and journalistic enterprise and public discourse, or whether it's important to try to have some sort of, I guess, ethical and legal enforcement on the edge, because sometimes when the article didn't really need, because sometimes it's just bad journalism. It's not good for society to have pieces written that have faults in them, and you know you don't know it, and you intentionally lawyer it. I'll stop there.
I want to ask our panelists to talk among themselves for a few more minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Obviously, each has raised some things that others might want to respond to. One of the things that I'm struck by with Jeanne Smolla's presentation is, on the one hand, the quotes that I read from Ed Wasserman this morning about how much on the web is such a free-for-all and is speech that would shock and appall a lot of us, and characterizations that are either patently false or unprovable, but for which no one is ever going to recover, ever going to be compensated for damage. On the other hand, from a journalist's perspective, a case rising and falling, based on sort of one word in the layout of a newspaper story. Not that that's illegitimate, but the standard seems so incredibly different. And, that's one thing I'd like to hear you all respond to. The other, of course, is Bob's observation that candidates are going to, going forward, and it's already started, going to have to be so incredibly careful that nothing interesting or enlightening, presumably, is ever going to happen again. And the extent to which, I think the implication was, if a lot of that is being generated by the other campaign, having stalkers listening to everything people say and then leaking it to reporters, what the journalist's job is in either picking up on that or just leaving it the hell alone. I've thrown a lot out there, but whatever anybody wants to respond to, go ahead.
Well, I think Bob is exactly right on your point, and I thought that was my biggest disappointment in what I watched in terms of media coverage. Just happens that I paid a lot of attention to CNN because I drive across the state all the time, and I have satellite television or satellite radio, and I happen to use CNN as my news source, and I'd come home after work and turn on a little Blitz or whatever, and I was often, there were some great things about its coverage and had some great people, and sometimes there would be wonderful commentary back and forth in things, but I thought it was ridiculous how each side would lift, as you said, a phrase. There are probably 100 examples. One that just pops into my mind is when John McCain said the fundamentals of the economy were sound, and he was ridiculed by Obama for doing that. And if you listen to CNN that day, they just bought into that game, and they just reported McCain's statement again and again and again, and Obama's rejoinder again and again and again. And I had to listen to all this airtime over what I thought was a vacuous, misdirected debate because it was completely out of context, that one little phrase, and if you listen to the whole thing, you realize it was a complex answer he was giving. And the point is, there were all kinds of really difficult, interesting, hard issues about what to do that were not being talked about by either person, either Obama or McCain. Maybe because they didn't know what to do, which I can't blame them for that, or anybody does, but I thought that was a real disservice to our discourse, and it just made me hate handlers. Because the other comment I'll have is I actually thought that both candidates are incredibly admirable people and very fascinating American stories, and probably very authentic, intelligent, interesting people. And they were so homogenized by their handlers and so scripted by their handlers. It damaged both. It damaged McCain much, much more, because I think McCain would have come off as a much more attractive candidate if he'd just been allowed to be who he was, and he wasn't ever, till the very end, perhaps. So I think you were exactly right.
And can I add a quick comment to that? One of the things I found really frustrating, I also watched a lot of CNN, and this is a criticism of their commentators. You would see them sitting at a table with their laptops open, or their BlackBerries in their hand, and they would read you something, or clearly be referencing what they have just been told by the media handlers, because there are media handlers as well as candidate handlers, from the other camp. My sources, in the Obama circle are saying this about that quote. Is that journalism? Why can't we actually see the people who work for Obama or work for McCain and see them say nasty things about the folks on the other side? Why do we have to have David Gergen sitting in the middle? He actually wasn't as bad as some of the others. Why do we have to have mediation of that conversation by people who allege some expertise that doesn't seem to be there?
All right, well, I'll come to the defense of my industry a little bit here. First of all, I'll leave CNN largely out of this, except, does everybody remember who Phil Singer was? Phil Singer was Hillary Clinton's press secretary, and I thought there was a brilliant moment on CNN when Gloria Borger, looking at her computer screen, said, well, what I'm hearing is blah, 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 blah. And Roland Evans, who was sitting next to her, looked at her computer screen and said, why do we care what Phil Singer has to say? It was like this total outing of what was going on. But getting back to, I think, a couple of points. The repetition. I think that this has been going on for a long time, and it's not going to change, and the handlers get a lot of power given to them. If a candidate wants to be authentic, a candidate can be authentic, and the handlers can rip their hair out. But we saw at the end Sarah Palin going rogue. I mean, these people are instructed in what to do, they are harangued in what to do, but in the end, they can do what they want. And so, any modern politician today knows that they have to watch their P's and Q's. But if they are truly an authentic candidate, they can go out there and behave that way. And John McCain made a choice. His whole primary, he was the maverick John McCain, and he made a decision to turn and become something else, and to cut off what was one of his strengths, which was his ability to really interact and show his personality. He stopped using humor, which he used with great advantage during the primary and that sort of thing. So I think the candidates themselves have to take that hit as much as their handlers do. But let's talk about the fundamentals of the economy. There comes a point in a campaign when a comment like that rings true, and it won't work if it doesn't. Barack Obama's bitter comment was talked about a great deal. He only went off message probably 3 times in a year and a half, which is extraordinary, and that was one of his moments. And the McCain campaign tried, and Hillary Clinton tried, to use it to knock him out of the race. It didn't work. he won working class voters. And he won many of those voters in Pennsylvania that were supposed to have been destroyed by this comment and so horribly offended by this comment. So the voters aren't dumb. And so even if we take a comment, we speaking broadly of the media and including the other side, and try to make voters see it in a way that doesn't fit for them when they see the candidate, it's not going to work. And that's what was wrong with John McCain's comment. If you look at the day he said it, in the context of the economy when he said it, and you looked at a narrative that was already starting to work about John McCain, much of it driven by himself with his self-inflicted wounds of saying he doesn't understand the economy. That narrative was out there, and when he said this, it suddenly became real. He didn't get it. I mean, when he said it that day, he had an old version of a speech, is essentially what he did, was he read his stump speech, or some version of it, because he had said that before. Then he went to the next event, and it was gone. And so there had been a conversation that went on in his campaign, and in fact he said that the economy was in trouble or something like that. But the problem with that comment was that it told us something about John McCain that rung true to voters. And then, with that frame of reference, as he moved through the rest of the campaign, it became truer and truer and truer. When he chose his vice president, you know, they would say, in hindsight, had we known what was going to happen, Romney might have been a higher player. There was no hindsight. The economy was in the toilet at the time he picked Sarah Palin. They knew it. They didn't see it. They didn't recognize it. They knew the economy was taking over the campaign debate and rising. It was already number one amongst voters. And they didn't see it. This is a mistake. And then, with the housing, you know, his first response is, we're not going to, you know, help these reckless people. And then he ends up in the campaign offering the most expansive, most expensive, and most generous package to all of those reckless investors. His plan, more generous, more expensive than Barney Frank's. So the problem with what he said was that it ended up resonating with voters as something right about him, that he didn't get what was going on with the economy. And then his behavior through the rest of the campaign reinforced that thinking. And if you look at all the public opinion polls, Barack Obama had 20 points on him in handling the economy throughout almost the entire general election. So I think that we have to give readers, voters, viewers some credit. There are plenty of times when the media will take 24 hours and try to turn, something into a major, singular, defining moment. And then you discover us the next day trying to turn something else into the singular, defining moment because nobody bought the argument the first time. And so I think that and given the fact that John McCain changed his speech, I thought that we were not wrong to talk about, to a large degree, given that it was the voters' most important concern, to talk about that comment. So I would defend us on that front.
Let's have a fuss over that, and so here's I guess my counter to that. It seems to me that, and I don't remember the exact sequence of events, but it seems to me that there was about a 7 or 8 or 9 day period from roughly when that comment was made, which must have been a day or 2 or 3 right after AIG and Lehman Brothers and that sort of that weekend, to the bailout vote. Mm-hmm. And I thought there was a powerful and important debate over whether it's fundamentally good or bad public policy to do the bailout, whether the money should be spent, whether the money should be given to banks to buy troubled assets, or some alternative mechanism should be used, whether the European approach to the rescue mission or the early American approach was right. And my sense is that over the last month, the decisions have changed, and that there's been a migration as to how the TARP funds are going to be used, and that some of the fundamental questions about the whole approach remain in play. And I don't know that I know the right answers to any of these, but there were the best part of the public policy debate for me were the conservative members of the House of Representatives, who were some from the Democratic side and Republican side, who voted against the bailout the first time. And that forced some genuine, honest policy debate. I didn't feel I was ever hearing anything clear about those policy choices from either McCain or Obama, ever, during that entire 8 or 9 day period. I felt I was hearing fuzz. And I didn't think, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and I didn't think that the tit for tat between the two of them over the sound bites, like the fundamental thing, illuminated any of those hard policy decisions. If I'd been McCain's handler, I would have said, your only chance to win the election, if you believe this, is to go to Mississippi and say I'm against the bailout. And I think and to go with the House Republicans, and say I'm against that whole theory of how to deal with this, and break from President Bush and do it. Now, I wouldn't have advised him to do it if he didn't believe it. But if he really in his heart believed that, if he had and so I'm agreeing with that part of you. It's his choice. I mean, the candidate's got to make these decisions. But I guess my complaint is there was fuzz from both Obama and McCain during that entire period, in which if one or the other had gone clearly for one view or the other, it would have been, I think, great for the country and great for the debate.
Well,
I don't think there's much discourse.
Yeah.
And what turns out to be memorable is the photo opportunity where Obama is standing with, adult economic advisors who offer some reassurance. Okay, he talks to Paul Volcker, he talks to Rubin and the rest. And you're right, there was not a serious discussion from either candidate. Now, there was danger for either candidate to get into that discussion. And in demeanor, Obama did win some points. And demeanor matters, but I guess I'm fundamentally in agreement with you.
They wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the media's role in that, there wasn't much we could do because they wouldn't say anything. Yeah, we asked all the questions. I mean, the one choice McCain did make in that period was to come back to suspend his campaign and come back to Washington, which to me was most astonishing because when he did that, it was a game-stopping moment. It did freeze the campaign because he was on a high wire and everybody knew it. And everybody was watching. And he set for himself his goal, and that was to come back to Washington and try to hammer out a bipartisan agreement on the bailout. So we knew his goal. And his complaint about Obama was that he was, quote, phoning it in. He was saying nothing, just phoning it in. And what I will wait for the books to try to understand is how, as your handler and as your candidate, and you make this decision, how you then arrive in Washington and have no plan. Mm-hmm. It appeared to me as though they were winging it for the next few days, and what happened was we all know he never met with a Democrat, so there's no bipartisan agreement happening here. I mean, for heaven's sakes, he could have met with Lieberman to act like he was, trying to negotiate a bipartisan agreement. But, once you set that out, it's then incumbent upon you to have a series of photo ops that reinforces that you're trying to accomplish what you said you were going to do. And then worst of all, he then goes over to his Virginia headquarters and literally phones it in. Mm-hmm. And so it was just one mistake after another that I think did serious harm to his campaign. So, as you said, it was dangerous for either one of them to try to touch that tar baby, and he was the one who did and paid, I think, a pretty high price for it.
I'll tell you a little anecdote right about that moment. I happened to be in Richmond the day of the as all this was unfolding. Richmond is Eric Cantor's district, and a very conservative columnist and economist named Walter Williams, who writes for the Times-Dispatch and others, was giving a speech at a big business function in Richmond at the Commonwealth Club. It's this old Richmond Wealth, and all the bankers and lawyers and so on. An audience of about 500 people. I'm guessing 98% Republican, you know, and the real sort of financial backbone group. This is the day the House had rebelled, right? And McCain is suspending the campaign, and all that's happening. And so this guy, Walter Williams, gives this speech and says, we should not, I'm with the House Republicans, there should be no bailout, you should let AIG fail, you should let it go. You should let the markets operate and let it go. The bailout won't work. I have no idea whether I agree or disagree. But I was listening to this. I was astonished at the forcefulness of his position, and I think he's kind of an outlier. He gets a standing ovation, and I'm looking around. These are establishment Republican, mainstream kind of people. These are George Bush's people, last few left in the country, and he's getting a standing ovation for the House side. And Eric Cantor's wife, Diana Cantor, is right there sitting next to me at this table. And I'm thinking, I wonder if she's going to tell him, go, join those guys. McCain comes back, and of course he was hearing from that crowd on Capitol Hill, right? To me, that was a defining moment. I said, that's when I said, if he wants to win this, if I just saw that standing ovation and the House is coming out against it, he could go back to Mississippi and say, guess what? I'm not in favor of a bipartisan agreement. As I think this through, as I listen to my friends in the House, this is what I think. And I think he would have rallied a Republican base, the free market folks. Even the leaders in the Bush administration were doing this whole bailout sort of against their soul. That would have been a brilliant moment. I think he lacked that if he was going to be a maverick, that was the moment to be a maverick, and he missed that opportunity. Assuming he believed it again, maybe he thought the bailout was right. I don't know. We don't know what he really thinks.
Let's start with the questions here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I have gone to the dark side. So, let's put it on the table. The media is biased. I came from Hyde Park, where Obama's from, and I went to University of Chicago School and to Columbia Journalism School to save the world. So I have all the sympathy in the world. Being a journalist is a terribly hard job, and you kind of do want to have to save the world to do it. But there's absolutely no question in my mind that this election was influenced. All the studies are showing it about the bias of the media. Now, so I just wanted nobody's mentioned that. I want to react, I'm just curious on a reaction about that. Now, I am perfectly happy that Obama won, because he clearly, he's shown himself to be smarter. Okay, so I wasn't for him, but I'm perfectly happy. And then just to take this further now, though, and a good point that was made yesterday, well, anyway, just to cut it. Now you have a cover of a major news magazine showing Obama looking like FDR and talking about the New Deal, right? But the facts are that during that time, unemployment was at 20%. That, talk about, pictures on things, circling around a photograph. And talk about the general level of sophistication of the American public. Just seeing that is very, very powerful, but the facts don't support it. It is not the Depression. It is not the New Deal situation.
Well, I can't really comment on that particular cover because I haven't seen it and I didn't do it.
Right.
But as for the complaints about media bias, we get this all the time. And the funny thing is, both John McCain and Barack Obama entered this race as sort of the media darlings. They both were media darlings. And I don't think that John McCain was treated unfairly in this campaign. And I think if you go back, and there have been some studies done that were done during the campaign that showed that, in fact, many, there were given weeks that Obama, the negative stories about Obama eclipsed those about McCain, particularly in the last couple of months. And that was, I think, because he was drawing more scrutiny because of the fact that he was a front runner. But, I mean, in the end, we write about what they do, and we write about what they say. And the bottom line is John McCain didn't run a good campaign. He didn't run a good primary. He didn't run a good general. And what can we do? And what do you do with that? I mean, there was a point, we had a conversation in Politico, and it was like, you know, what can we say that, you know, would be a good story for John McCain? I mean, we literally sat down and thought about it. It was like, what do you say? I mean, everything, the wheels were falling off of the campaign. And so, I mean, at a certain level, you just got to cover the car wreck in front of you, and if it's not good, it's just not good, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So, you know, I think that McCain came in, unlike some other Republicans who I think have come in and had more hostile relationships with the news media, and so, you know, when they say the media hates me, they have like evidence of like a history of clashes with the media. McCain came in without any of that. He was like one of the few Republicans who might go on the national stage with that kind of relationship with the media. So, you know, I mean, in the end, it is what it is. And if he'd run a good campaign, then we'd be writing about a good campaign. I mean, my specialty is money and politics. And, you know, I had to note 3 times in the campaign that John McCain was broke. You know, I can't help that. I didn't do it. I didn't, like, not give him money. So, I mean,
I totally agree. I completely agree. As I say, the best man won in terms of running a campaign. But if we're talking about the subtleties and the subtle influences and really being realistic, you know, just that, I mean, I will give an example of going back to Columbia Journalism School, and there was a panel like this, and Mike Isikoff was there. I happen to know that he took 1 week to break the Monica Lewinsky story. He didn't want to break it. He did not break it until he had to break it. And I raised my hand and I asked that. He said, well, at that time it wasn't whatever. And I just said, well, wouldn't sheer he was given the tapes, wouldn't sheer journalistic curiosity have made you want to listen to the tapes that you were given? And I was booed. That's, you know, I mean, that was my school. And it's like, I just was asking what I was taught. And it was like, journalism now is supposed to equal being, and I was gassed in Chicago in '68. I've been on the other side too. We're talking about, and I just want to ask one more thing to you. What are you talking about that the candidates, what is it that you want to have happen? I mean, the fact that the campaigns are so managed means that every single comment that can be picked up by a journalist is a drop of water in the desert. What is it that you think the answer is?
Well, I'm on your side, I think. I'd like, well, like many people, I'd like a different debate format. I would like to see more unscripted time from the candidates. The incentives are all against it, and I don't think it's going to happen. It's kind of a futile thing to plead for. But I want to comment briefly about, was there bias toward Obama? I think we have a kind of cultural preference for the less experienced candidate. If you look at the history of modern presidential races, having more experience doesn't win it for you. We liked Carter over Ford. We liked Reagan over Carter. We liked Clinton over the elder President Bush.
Bush over Gore.
And we liked Bush over Gore. If you're newer, it's easier for you to have an interesting narrative or for you to construct one. In Obama's own calculations, he's of an age where he could have chosen not to run this time, wait till later. We actually know he had conversations with people who said, no, the longer you wait, the less likely you are to be interesting. You will have cast more controversial votes. You'll be more tainted by serving as a senator. So I think you are correct that he received perhaps an unfair advantage, but I'm not sure it's one that you can attribute to a media bias. It's a kind of cultural bias, if that's the right terminology. We want new people on the scene, and we get excited about what they might offer. Now, there was also enormous substance to his newness and to the possibility of the first African-American president and the rest. So it isn't just being new. There were elements of his story that had a real
Totally,
emotional
and I
power.
think his decision to talk about race brought me to tears. It was courageous. It went against everything he was told, and I am thrilled to have the first African-American president and
that
all those
speech
good things.
After
But
the
I'm just saying, I can't believe we've had a panel without talking about how...
Well, Nia, if you also look at what were the negative storylines on Obama, they were Resco, Ayers, and Reverend Wright. And every one of them got extensive coverage. So, it's not like a situation where somebody sat on a story for a week and hesitated to report it. I know Politico had Ayers stories the summer before, the fall of '07. We had an extensive piece on who was Ayers and what about this coffee and that sort of thing. Newspapers largely did Reverend Wright in that same period. It was more around Iowa. But it wasn't until the tape emerged, which Reverend Wright himself had made, that the televisions could do it, because they needed that sort of visual thing, given their medium. But as soon as they got it, it went out. And so, I think we could face a lot more criticism if, there either had been reluctance or some attempt to, not run the Reverend Wright tapes. But none of that happened. I mean, the 3 negative storylines on him, they were aired. And I think you would be hard-pressed to find a voter who had not heard of one of those 3 people, Resco being the lesser of them.
I'm not criticizing the profession at all, because it's all motivated by the noblest beliefs that you're doing what's correct. I would use the word what's right, but I'll use the word what's correct. But, what journalist couldn't run the tapes?
But when you
talk
talk
about
about
his hair was on fire.
But when you talk about
you don't get a gold star for running, and you have to say it's incredible that it took tapes coming out on the internet. Everybody in Chicago knew. Now, I don't have anything against Obama for going to that church, and I don't want to dominate. But I had nothing against him for going to that church. That was the smart and political thing to do. He ran a brilliant campaign. I have no problem with that.
I would like to get to some of the other...
Yeah.
Can I just chime in on this, because I think I pretty strongly disagree with you. I think that I don't think that any blame whatsoever exists with the media at all. I'm completely a defender of journalists and the media on this score. I don't think there's such a thing as the media anymore. I wrote a piece a while back called "Where Have You Gone, Walter Cronkite." There was a time when there was a kind of media. There were 3 or 4 networks and some agenda-setting, newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on. We have such an incredibly robust culture now. There are so many thousands of outlets, many of which are individually biased, of course. If you drive late at night and listen to the Savage Nation, or you listen to Rush Limbaugh, you're going to get one take. You're going to get an entirely different take from other bloggers, and there's such a check and balance. There's such richness. There's so many brilliant journalists and commentators, and there's no agenda setter anymore. There's no Walter Cronkite anymore, and so I think that a candidate has the opportunity to be authentic if they want to break through and do it, and I think we're sort of hungry for that. I will say this: I think that Obama did break through, if not always very specifically on specific policy matters, his personality did come through. There was an authenticity, in my view, to the way he presented himself. But he got the heck attacked out of him by, thousands of outlets that were very against him for all sorts of reasons, legitimate and illegitimate. So I just don't, I think, of course, an individual reporter may be biased. A particular reporter may do something that you think is unethical. Whole story that you think should have been broken. But to generalize about a whole culture of people, I just, to me, it's not.
That's not what I said. Sorry.
Well, I know, but I mean,
more time. That's not what I said.
I know, but I guess what I'm saying is,
I'm
not attacking your position so much as the argument that there is such a thing as the media anymore in the way we're using it, a collective that has a consciousness or a direction one way or the other.
I want to talk about this robustness for a second, or ask you some questions about it. Especially you, Jeanne, about this business about blogs versus Politico's effort to instill the kind of traditional journalistic values. And the fact is, Politico and lots of other sites, because they have user-generated content and bloggers and so forth, publish a lot of, what can we say, bullshit, basically. And stuff that you as journalists would never, ever agree to say for publication, yet you're publishing this stuff. Is this, Rod, back to this robustness, is it too robust? Should there be warning signs for the blog part of a website? How do you deal with this kind of issue?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's one that the whole industry grapples with because, bloggers are credentialed as media, and so there's kind of an ongoing debate about should there be separate credentials for bloggers, but then you have bloggers that are associated with Politico who are more journalistically grounded, if not just by nature of their training. And then you have, bloggers who are like Daily Costs and Red State and, some of the others that are really personality driven by the thoughts and ideology of the founder of that blog. So it's an ongoing debate, and I imagine eventually it'll sort itself in a way that there are kind of different communities. I don't know that a blogger would ever go along with some kind of warning label on the top of their column. But I think it reminds me of like talk radio, where eventually people sort of figured it out. That if I want a particular viewpoint, then I want to go look at, say, these 4 or 5, or hear from these 4 or 5 people. And if I want the other, I listen to these 4 or 5. And it could be that consumers eventually will start to figure this out. Where I find the blogs dangerous is that when you do a Google search, you stumble onto something and you can't decide if it's real or not. And that's the part that I think is risky to where we're going. And it's particularly so like the links I mentioned about in stories. And you hear this from other journalists, if they Google and they'll see something and they don't know if it's legit or not, and so they back away from it. Well, that's a good instinct, I think, to back away from it. And that's where I find the links in stories to be imprudent. Because if you haven't done the reporting on it, why put it into something that has your name at the top of it? I think it raises a lot of legal issues as well as just journalistic problems.
Let me just follow up on that a little bit. This is about labeling. Traditional media does it every day. It says opinion. I wonder, because don't you feel like it strikes at the credibility of anything electronic now? If everything electronic is, robust is putting it mildly.
Well, if you meet the bloggers though, they think they're right.
Yeah.
So, to them it's factual. To many of them. You know what I mean? They don't view it as this is just me spouting off. This is me telling people what's real and what's true for some of them. So that's why I think any kind of labels would probably be resist it. Now, in a case like Politico, would we at some point label them differently? I think that I would rule that out as something that might happen at some point.
I have actually a Google blogging story that I've bored all my colleagues in journalism with over the years, but there are a few students who haven't heard this. In 2004, CBS ran the story that got Dan Rather fired, the story about the National Guard, with these documents that turned out to be dubious. Lieutenant Commander Killian was the commanding officer. There was one living person in that first story who they presented as Killian's assistant, who looked at the documents and said what they say is what he was talking about at the time. That person was named Robert Strong, and CBS said he's now a professor. It turns out he's an English professor in Austin, but he knew what he was stepping into. So he had removed every reference to himself that he possibly could off the internet. And he had made CBS promise, don't tell anybody my phone number, don't tell anybody my address, don't tell anybody the institution I'm affiliated with. So that story went on, and immediately afterwards, people, who is Professor Robert Strong? And because we have an aggressive public affairs office, I was at the top of the Google list. And I began receiving hate mail. And this wasn't just references to me in the blogs. Later on, I went back and looked and found those. Those were pretty bad. But you can find my Vita. You can get my email address immediately. I began receiving really vicious mail, and lots of it. And how much is George Soros paying you? Why are you lying about our president? There was it was funny at first and kind of ironic. They were complaining that CBS hadn't carefully, done their research. Well, they hadn't carefully done their research about me. There were only 3 or 4, I guess there were 5 people who were Professor Robert Strong when you Googled that day. And there were only 2 of us who were of an age where we might have been, contemporaries of Bush in Texas. It's a strange experience. The next day, my phone was lit up, and there were calls from Time Magazine, New York Times, Washington Post. All those people wanted to know, are you the Robert Strong you referred to last night on CBS? And to all of them, I said no, and they were very polite and moved on. But the bloggers didn't, and the hate mail didn't, until 3 or 4 days later when the Associated Press found the actual persons. It's a scary thing to get in the middle of one of those. It's better than having sex with Mel Gibson. I guess. But, the innocent people who can get swept up in that, that is a real concern.
And the tone of it, I find disturbing. I find the tone.
There were threats I
Yeah.
received.
Yeah.
And I stopped, eventually I just stopped
Looking.
looking. And I also tried to reply to people, and they had all rigged their email messages so that you couldn't reply. Which,
That's interesting.
yeah.
I'm not sure I understood it exactly, but you talked about the 2 sides of Twitter. Aren't you lending credibility to the less careful side by putting your name, associating your name with it?
Yeah, that was why that was one of the points I was trying to make earlier, that when Ben and the editors made a choice to run Edward's thing in the blog and not as a newspaper story, and they thought that would work, and it didn't. It didn't work at all. And so now we know that indeed, it is viewed as one entity. And so the bloggers, we have 5 blogs, and they, still either have to, meet the standards that we do with the newspapers or the news stories that we try to run, or explain it. And that's the other really interesting thing that we've done with the blog is it's like Ben or Jonathan Martin, who had done the Republican blog for us. They'll say, at the top of something. I don't know if this is right, but this is what, I've heard. And so they'll just be a lot more frank when they put it on the blog. Now, obviously, something like that would never be a news story. But the funny thing with the blogs that I think is will change the political arena, is that the age of dirty tricks is really in for a reckoning. Because, I turned to our White House editor, and when the robocalls went out, and Ben and Jonathan both said, "We're hearing about robocalls, what do you hear?" And kaboom, we got scripts, we got tapes. And I turned to Charlie, I said, when you can't run a self-respecting push poll or a dirty robocall anymore, what are we coming to here? There's nowhere to hide. And, the bidder in San Francisco hitting Pennsylvania is another example of it. But I was really the direct mail that always goes on fire negative at the end of a campaign. And in just last cycle, I had gotten a family in Ohio and a family in Pennsylvania to collect their direct mail and mail it back to me, all this snail mail, to the Wall Street Journal, so I could see what was going on with the direct mail at the end. Forget it. They get it, and they scan it, and boom, it's gone. So the whole way that campaigns have figured out how to try to, in the 11th or 12th hour, to undercut an opponent is going to come in for some major reform. They'll figure it out, but...
Just one real quick, looping back to something that John is, I want to disagree with myself, which I like to do. I was celebrating the robustness of our culture, and that's good. But I think one negative is then you also get this fragmentation, and people tune into what they believe, and so everybody's tuning into the right wingers are tuning into Rush Limbaugh and so on. And then I think we do lose something there, because we lose some, I'm kind of a centrist, and you lose some possibility for national community and consensus. The other real quick thing I'll say is I do think we're cultivating a little bit of a pop-off culture. And, I'll write a piece in Slate or something, and then within an hour there'll be 50 things. And I don't read them a whole lot, but sometimes you'll just say, well, this person thought about this for all of 3 seconds, and they just pop something off. And I kind of see it in our students a lot too, and I really worry about it for law students. I'll see an email dialogue go back and forth, and sometimes very reckless statements in an email, and unprofessional things, and so on. And I'll say, you just can't go say the first thing that comes into your mind if you're going to be a professional and be a serious person in discourse. But I think that the robustness of the culture kind of creates that instinct in people. And I think that hurts sometimes because those statements are often very hurtful and damaging, and they make the speaker look bad because they make you look frivolous. And so that's sort of a disagreement with myself.
Well, I do think we're in the ADD nation right now, and the three of you fell right into it because you all agreed that when the economy went to hell in a handbasket, the two major candidates didn't say anything. They kind of hung back. Well, why should they say anything? Wouldn't it make sense to contemplate, to think about it, to kind of wait a little bit, to see what's going to happen, to really come up with something substantial? And then you were complaining that, well, how come they didn't come out and tell us?
That is a good point, John. And I do want to say this. I would have no difficulty with that if someone had the honesty to say, this is very difficult, and I don't, Now that happened because of the sense of emergency. That itself was in a way a position, because the idea that we would go slower was taking a position that we wouldn't bail out right away, so it was fraught. But it would have been somewhat refreshing to have one of them say, there are these policy options, they're difficult. I guess no candidate ever wants to say that. They don't look presidential if they say that.
I think they had enough time to contemplate it, and I think it's a leadership moment.
Yeah, I think it's.
And I think they used it as a political moment.
Yes, I think I agree with you.
I just wanted to quickly ask about deadlines, and because it strikes me that my experience always was that it was a deadline pressure that when I made errors, and I made plenty of them.
Right.
Now, it appears that you're constantly under deadline.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when you made an error, you knew that you were going to be the next day before you could correct it. Now you can correct it
Yeah.
immediately, so maybe it doesn't seem as serious.
Oh, no, it's still, you
but
still hate making.
There may be those, though, who say, well, I'm going to go with this. I know I can correct it right away. Can you talk a little bit about what the deadline, and it's not just Politico, which is internet only, but every newspaper I see, I think they're almost constantly on deadline.
Yeah, it's very true. It is, journalism will become a totally AAA personality kind of place, if it wasn't before more so. Politico has both. We have a print edition that runs, circulates around Capitol Hill. So we run on two systems. And so we have traditional newspaper deadlines. But then we have the Feed the Beast, the web. And there is enormous pressure to be first. Enormous. And it is, that's one reason why for young journalism students it can be a real challenge, because you'll learn how to write on deadline. And learning and making mistakes under these kinds of pressures are, the risk factor there is very high. And we had a couple of reporters at Politico who seemed to think you could, slap something up there and then read it, and then go back and like tweak and fix and, and they were sort of constantly going back into their copy and, we had to say stop, that's not appropriate. And, but there is that temptation that, well, I'll just get the first, thing up there and then I'll fix it. And that's, that is a problem. And the deadline stress does lend itself to errors. And so you do have to discipline yourself, to step back. And I deal with numbers, which scares the crap out of me, that I get a number wrong. And so what I do is I backstop myself now with more people to make sure they do calculations too. So it's done in real time. I save time, but it's my way of double checking myself.
Was there any magic, was there any magic to 8 o'clock for the Palin story? Because you said it broke at 8 o'clock.
That's when I was done.
It just happened?
Yeah, that's when I was
Because it
done.
sort of hit the middle of the nightly talk show.
Yeah, the reaction was unbelievable.
Yeah.
But no, it was around 8 o'clock, but that was just when I was done. And therein, I got somebody at the Federal Election Commission to calculate behind me to make sure because I knew that number had to be dead on. That one was, and I had a second, one of the line editors who was still in the office at that time. We stopped and we went over every single number to make sure that it was correct. Because I knew that one was going to get a lot of scrutiny, if not by the public at large. The McCain and campaign and the RNC were going to go through that one with a comment. As they should.
We're unfortunately about out of time. I wanted to ask each of our panelists if they have a concluding statement or final thoughts before we wrap this up. I'm going to indulge myself to make a couple of observations. They may or may not be contradictory, but this whole discussion of the past couple of days, one thing that occurs to me is the old bromide that democracy is messy, and I think if what's going on the web is a sort of democratization of information, both access and dissemination, obviously it's very messy. And the other is Daniel Patrick Moynihan's observation that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not everyone is entitled to his own set of facts. And as we go forward, it's going to be interesting to see how new media reconcile both of those statements. I want to thank our panel. And thank you all for coming.
Rush to a high school football game.
I must have sent Brian.
I will say, well,
He sent me an email not too long ago, but I was with Richmond before I went.